Hello, Chin here. Not so much a formal video, but mostly just me reflecting on my own thoughts and kind of summarizing what I've learned over the last month in the book that I just recently completed, The Five Love Languages by Gary Chapman. So let's dive right into it to give you some context in terms of where some of my insights are coming from and what I'm focusing a bit more on. I am recently a parent of two children. One is 4 year old, one is a year old. Obviously married as well to a wife, and I'm also a business consultant and a sales consulting specialist. So I think what I'm trying to draw from in some of the lessons that I see is in and around both personal but also business in relation to kind of how we treat customers, how we treat employees as well. So yeah, I guess the first takeaway that really stands out in the book is harks back to Dale Carnegie's words, treat others not the way that you would like to be treated, but the way that they would like to be treated. That's the main thing. And based on what Gary is saying in his book, the main takeaway is that it's not that we don't love others. In some cases, what goes wrong with a lot of marriages is that we are communicating love, but in different languages to each other. And what he means by different languages is he'll go into the five different forms, but generally most people have a different preference or kind of language in terms of how they perceive being loved and prioritize. So to kind of set some context in and around his examples, he talks a bit about how a rough analogy could be that we as humans, we all have this love tank that needs to be filled, kind of like a car. And if it's empty, we don't feel love, and we end up misbehaving in a misguided attempt to seek attention and obtain the form of love which we seek. And another thing to understand leading into the forms of languages is that when we as people are going through that dating phase, the way he describes it is that we are in love. And being in love is this mythical feeling. The key thing to note in his description is that this emotion does not last forever. It is more of an obsession rather than a choice. We only focus on the other partner and nothing else matters. So some kind of defining characteristics of being in love, based on this definition, is that number one, we can't control when and with who that feeling manifests. Number two, it's effortless. There's no discipline required. We're willing to do anything for the other person. And then number three, which is the main one that I really kind of feel that is a bit clear, is that we stop focusing on our own growth, and nor do we care for the growth or development of the other person, because in our eyes, whoever we are in love with is quote unquote perfect. So the main thing to know is that this is a temporary high, and we must now, after that period wanes off, pursue what he calls real love. It's an emotional love, but not obsessional, right? It requires discipline. It requires both personal growth of yourself, but also growth of the other. And it's a choice. So we choose to love the other person with intent, not with instinct. And true love cannot begin until that in love kind of phase has run its course, unless we are blinded by that emotional high that we feel. So moving into the different languages, there are five main ones that he identified. And to kind of set the tone to help you understand which one might resonate with you more, a few things. Number one is that obviously not everyone only has one language and doesn't care about everything else. But the key thing is to understand what is someone's primary language, because that is what they crave the most. And if you are fulfilling that, then the other person will feel love. It doesn't mean that all the other languages are not important, right? Other things to pay attention to is number one is generally whatever you are most readily and willingly providing, that may be your form, your primary form. But again, it's not always the case. What you tend to criticize others in, criticize your spouse in, may also be the area which you have the biggest need for, or that gap. Yeah, so those are just something to pay attention to. So number one is words of affirmation. So these are people who seek and feel love when they are complimented, they are appreciated, they feel that the other person has a sense of gratitude towards them. And the key behind that is not being silent and not taking things for granted, not just flattery. It's actually sincerely praising them, and also thanking them for the things that they're doing. The more they feel love, obviously, the more they will reciprocate and do something that you desire. So instead of nagging someone, so for example, in some of the examples he gives is, instead of nagging someone like, oh, how, when was the last time you did dishes? Or it's been like 4 years since you baked me a pie, kind of thing. It's more about, hey, making sincere and honest requests and say like, oh, I would really love if you made this because I really love your pies. Like, people are more likely to do the things that you want them to do if you are positioning it the right way, so to speak. It's not about manipulating them, but it's more about instead of nagging and chastising people, it's giving a form of sincere praise and then making a genuine request coming out of that. Not only words of affirmation in and around compliments and gratitude, but also he talks about encouraging words. So how can you, inspire courage? How can you push people to do the things that they may be afraid of doing themselves? How can you inspire action, inspire improvement, right? Maybe because we ourselves are afraid to do it because of fear of rejection or failure. So yeah, kind of fostering their inherent and intrinsic interests. We need to notice what is important for the other person. And, let's say if someone seems to value, let's say, cooking, for example, then encouraging that behavior and say like, hey, you know what? I think you could actually possibly be a chef. Why don't you take up a culinary course? Or, I think you would be a great author. You're really great at writing. So actually supporting our spouses in growing themselves as well. Another thing in and around that is mostly just communicating, that you care, that you're there to support, that you are on their side. The last kind of piece in and around that, around words of affirmation, is paying attention to the tone of voice as well, and not just what you say. So the example he gives is, if you say, I love you versus I love you versus I love you, like a question mark. So to be soft, to be gentle, not accusatory, as you are engaging, especially in arguments, which will naturally come in any relationship. Focusing on not getting overly riled up by what is being discussed, which is natural. Naturally, we tend to lash back and become defensive when people are bringing up issues that challenge our personal identity. And because we feel that we lack a certain type of love and we feel that the spouse is not expressing it in the right way. So making sure that we are soft, we are gentle in the way that we negotiate some of that. He also he gives some tips around negotiating arguments. He talks a bit about stop keeping score of the past or the wrongdoings, focus on the now and the future. Not to say that the past is erasable, but instead of focusing on it, we can accept it as history. Yeah, it's gone, it's happened. Yes, it hurts, but live today free of the failures of yesterday. And forgiveness is also an expression of love. So yeah, he talks a bit about that, humble words, making requests instead of demanding things. And even one tip he gives for those who are not comfortable with words of affirmation is he calls it indirect words of affirmation. So praising your spouse to their, let's say, friends or to their parents, and they will, by virtue of proximity, also hear about you praising them from their friends or parents. So those are just some tips in and around that. The second language is quality time. So somewhat related to words and conversations as well, but it's mostly about being present, giving the other party the sense that you are there and they have your undivided attention, right? So quality time can be in the form of both quality conversations, but also in the form of quality activities as well, things that you do together while you're fully present. And it's not so much in and around quality time where I guess the biggest misconception some people get when they try to apply this is that when someone is sitting down and they're listening to a spouse talk, they tend to go into kind of prescription mode, and they try to troubleshoot the problem and give solutions and answers. But it's mostly about, like, as you are listening, if your spouse is complaining about their day, not jumping to providing solutions, but listening for feelings, empathizing, and kind of really showing them that you are there, you are on their side, and you support them. It's not, they're not doing it to get an answer, to get a solution. So yeah, those are some tips in and around quality time. The third one, and this is probably one that I struggle with the most, is gifts. Because it's probably my weakest language, although it is apparently my spouse's primary language. So that's something I need to work on. Is visual symbols of love. So some people feel love when they have something that they can see that reminds them. And gifts, that the key takeaway here is not necessarily spending and buying things that your spouse will like, but also could be gifts that are found, curated, made, not just necessarily bought, right? And also it may be even like giving the gift of self and giving the gift of time as well. So those are just understanding how you can phrase some of those. The one thing to be mindful of, though, is because gifts are visual in nature, giving the gift of self or giving time is not as visual. So it may not be top of mind for them. But just thinking about how can you constantly remind them of that. Some tips as well. He talks about gifts that are good now and later. So for example, like seeds or tickets to an event, you give them something now that they anticipate using in the future date as well, or like you plant something now and then you can harvest later as well, those kind of things. So we've covered three. We've talked a bit about affirmation, quality time, and gifts. The last two is one is act of service, and the last one is physical touch. So acts of service are in and around. People feel love when they feel like someone is doing something for them. I guess especially in the Asian culture, this comes more naturally than most to others, because they feel like that in Asia we have this culture of self-sacrifice and doing things for others. But that the most important thing is to pay attention and to understand what your spouse values as acts of service. Are there things that you care, that you feel that you are doing in your expression of love, things that they actually care about? Because if those are things that are, priority number 10 on their list, then they might not still feel the same sense of appreciation as they would if it was something that they care about the most. Key thing here is you're not doing these things because you are fearful of the spouse or out of guilt or out of resentment or coercion, but you're doing it because you want to, not necessarily because you enjoy it. And I think that the bigger takeaway is that if your spouse knows that this is something that you don't enjoy and yet you still do it for their sake, then they will feel it more so than ever that you are doing it as an expression of love for them. The main thing that he harps on in this chapter is not stereotyping yourself and not attaching yourself to kind of norms in and around relationships and what a husband or wife may be doing, especially if you're in a heterosexual relationship. Because in most households, generally, men are brought up to think that the wife is supposed to be the primary caregiver in and around cleaning, dealing with the child, those kind of things. Men shouldn't change diapers, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, it's not about what one person should or should not do. It's more about if that person values you doing certain things for them, then do those things for them, whether you like it or not. Which again ties back into how he talks about love being an act of choice, not something that you're doing involuntarily, right? The last one he talks about in and around physical touch, it might be more obvious rather than not to most men, but it's not just necessarily about sexual intimacy, but also, small things like hugging, holding hands, stroking a person's hair, kissing, those kind of things as well. And not to confuse this physical desire with the emotional desire in and around touch. Many men he speaks about, he say men desire sex, but that alone may be insufficient, right? If you lose desire to have sex, if your emotional needs are not met, for example, if let's say your primary language is affirmation, and if you feel that you never get complimented or your wife constantly berates you, then you will lose that desire to have sex as well, no matter how attractive that person is as well. So understanding that component of physical touch. So I think those are the five key things. I'll summarize it again quickly. So affirmation, quality time, gifts, acts of service, and physical touch. And what is interesting here that he notices as well is that when you're in love, when you're in the courtship phase, the dating phase, most people tend to kind of manifest all those forms. Like when you're dating someone, you tend to praise them, you flatter them, you're more physical with them, you give them lots of gifts, you do lots of things, you sacrifice for them, and you spend a lot of quality time with them. Like they're pretty much your center of your world. And then what happens is once you settle into a long-term relationship, or even if you get married as well, is people tend to default to what they expect a normal relationship to look like. And because they do that, they may sometimes not exhibit the behaviors that they were typically exhibiting while they were in courtship. And this may cause the other spouse to feel that they no longer love them. So for example, like when you get married, you may feel like, oh, okay, now I'm married, I expect my wife to do certain things for me. I expect my wife to, have a meal ready for me at the end of the day. And if you're doing these kind of things and you stop doing other things, like for example, you're like, oh, I'm married now, I don't have to buy gifts anymore, then if your spouse's primary language is in and around gifts, then that's going to be challenging, right? Some other kind of key tips in and around the book as well, and then I'll kind of dive into some takeaways. So I talked about how to discover your primary love language. So one is like, how do you regularly express yourself? Number two, what do you request most often from your spouse? And actually, there's that one, which is what does your spouse do or fail to do that hurts you the most? So those are kind of things to pay attention to that might help you shed some light on what is your primary language. The other thing is to focus in on around the topic of love is a choice. It's not about doing things that you enjoy. It's about doing things that will benefit or let the other person feel love because you love them, even if that expression isn't something that you are used to or comfortable with. So this is where he challenges couples, especially if you're not comfortable with a specific expression, to still work on it. It isn't insincere. So I think he has an example of someone talking about how she felt uncomfortable expressing love sexually when they have negative feelings towards someone. And he talks about, there's a difference between love as a feeling versus love as an action. You're not claiming to have feelings that you don't, but you're expressing an act of love for the other person's benefit or pleasure. It is a choice. It's not an action that's grown out of a deep emotional bonding. It is simply for their benefit, and you are expressing it to tell the other person that they love and that you love them. And ideally, if they feel love, they will naturally want to reciprocate as well. Yeah, so those are some key tips. My personal takeaway, especially as I'm a parent going as I'm a new parent, paying more attention to my kids as well, is this also manifests very well in children as well. And I think it may evolve over time depending on how they're brought up as well. But generally in children, words of affirmation manifest in the form of children constantly seeking praise or being very generous with giving praise. Touch, on the other hand, obviously liking to hold your hand, liking to be touched, to be as in hugged, goodnight kisses, those kind of things. Gifts, very straightforward, giving presents. Time. So if your child misbehaves in order to seek attention-seeking behavior, like that is mainly them lacking the quality time. And then service, children enjoy helping out, enjoy helping out their little siblings, helping you out around the house, those kind of things. And obviously, if their emotional needs are not met, they may violate acceptable standards of behavior. And it's basically a misguided attempt to seek out that form of love, which they aren't getting. And yeah, sometimes it also manifests in your child possibly seeking love in inappropriate places, or getting involved in sexual misconducts, or expressing anger towards your parents, those kind of things. So the example that he gives, if it's more relatable for some people, is that there's a difference between buying a bicycle for a child versus spending time riding with them. you may feel that you are expressing your love for them by buying them a bicycle, but if it's not their primary love language, then that alone, that sincere act alone is insufficient. Sincerity alone is not enough. They might still feel that you don't love them, right? So yeah, many parents sincerely love their children, but sometimes they fail to communicate it correctly. So yeah, just be mindful of that. As a new parent, another one that I'm also a bit more mindful of is that when new parents have children, we may tend to kind of put our relationship with our spouse in the backseat by focusing on our children. And in the short term, we might not notice it as much because we get our love tanks filled by the expressions that our child may be giving us. So for example, one of my primary love languages is words of affirmation. And if my child Toby, or let's say Gerald, if they're expressing that form of love to me, I may not need it as much from my spouse. But if I overlook that, and if I don't continue to work on my relationship, then we would end up in a situation where once our children become more independent, and we're left in a situation where our marriage is not in a very healthy place. So making sure that you don't just stay content with kind of getting your emotional needs met by your children, but also encouraging your spouse to manifest those forms of emotion to you, and also you yourself manifesting the right love language for your spouse. So those are some of my key takeaways. I guess the same applies in the business world as well. Really understanding kind of as you're communicating with both your employees and your clients or prospects, to understand how they like to feel appreciated. If you're motivating them, it's not always money that is the only motivating factor. If someone, let's say if you're working in a sales team and you're trying to motivate someone for good performance, it's not necessarily always giving them gift cards. Some people want to get praised, right? Some people want some other form. Maybe they want to feel like you're paying attention to them, right? But obviously some things may be appropriate in the workplace and inappropriate otherwise. So naturally, like physical touch might not be applicable in the business world. But yeah, that's my quick summary of the book, and I hope it's been helpful for you.